I will say this one last time, sir. Leave my yacht. The voice wasn't loud, but it was cold sharp and rang out like the crack of crystal glass against the backdrop of soft jazz. Charlotte Wynne, the event coordinator, stood tall in a pearl-toned gown, her posture rigid, as if nothing on this deck had the right to disrupt the flawless curvature of perfection she embodied. Around her guests, draped in silk, bearing faint smiles and expensive champagne flutes. No one spoke, but everyone heard. Some phones had already discreetly pivoted in that direction. Cameras switched on, held steady, as if they were used to seeing someone escorted out of a world that silently believed he didn't belong. He stood a few steps from the edge of the deck, one hand resting gently on the railing, his gaze following the waves brushing against the yacht's hull in the amber light of dusk. A black man, around 40, dark grey suit, precisely tailored, no logo, nothing flashy, just silence, and a cocktail barely touched. Charlotte stepped forward. The scent of her perfume overpowered the sea breeze. She tilted her head, offering a faint smile, one that carried no goodwill. I don't care what your invitation says. Places like this aren't for people like you. Still the man said nothing. But somewhere in the background, glasses clinked, as if discomfort had quietly reached even the corners of the tables. Some smiled awkwardly. Some looked down into their drinks. Some turned away, as if not witnessing meant it never happened. A young white man muttered, "He probably doesn't know it's a closed event." Another woman whispered, "Looks like a technician who stumbled into the wrong place." And as all the glances, all the unspoken judgments swirled around him, the man still stood. No bowed head, no rebuttal, just a steady gaze as if he'd grown used to rejection long before he ever got the chance to speak. Malcolm Rivers was no stranger to looks like that. He'd seen them from behind the dishwashing station of a restaurant when he was 17, from the back of boardrooms, where he adjusted projectors, and inside high-rise elevators, where people hesitated for half a second to make sure he hadn't pressed the wrong floor. Now, on a gold-plated yacht adrift in Manhattan Bay, the eyes hadn't changed, but something else had. He had. 16 years ago, Malcolm stood at Pier 12, just behind where the yacht now docked. Every Monday morning he'd wake at 4 a.m., walk 9 blocks, and line up for a backup prep cook shift. These yachts used to feel so extravagant that even standing nearby made him instinctively keep his distance, as if the decks themselves could detect class by the scent of hand-washed clothes. Today he boarded through the main entrance, no bowed head, no lowered gaze, and most importantly, he wasn't here to serve anyone. But something about his silence made people more uncomfortable than noise ever could. Charlotte didn't see a quiet man. She saw a disruption. No flashy watch, no loud mention of an Ivy League education, no forced laughter to prove he was just like everyone else. Just presence. Still, unapologetic. And in her world that was unmanageable. When Malcolm stepped onto the yacht, the sunset was brushing the outer edge of the deck. His shadow stretched long, cutting across polished Italian shoes and past amber-colored champagne, swirling gently in crystal glasses. A young man wearing a name tag that read Noah nodded at him from the stairs. Malcolm returned the nod with a faint smile. Easy to overlook, but enough to make Noah pause. Something didn't quite feel like a stranger. Malcolm didn't notice. He was too focused not on people, but on how people reacted to him, how their eyes moved from his face to his suit, from his rounded brown leather shoes to his deep brown skin, then back away, as if they had just inspected an item and decided not to buy. He'd learned to read that language long ago. Back in public high school, when the gym teacher once said straight to his face, "People like you should stick to mechanics. Don't dream about Harvard." Back when his mother had been denied at the bank simply because her shaky handwriting made them assume she was forging someone else's signature. And even though Malcolm would later build a global logistics firm with over 4,000 employees and $1.2 billion in contracts across 3 continents, that look never changed. They didn't care what was in your head. They only needed your skin tone and your silence to decide everything else. Charlotte had first noticed Malcolm from the second-floor balcony as he stepped off the dock. She'd been laughing loudly with a few fashion partners, but when she saw him, the laughter stopped. It wasn't exactly hatred, and not quite fear. It was just familiarity. She was used to people like him showing up on staff rosters, tech crew, logistics team, or as she once joked, the guy who cleans up broken crystal. And tonight, when he wasn't wearing an apron, rubber shoes, or a radio headset, but walked upright, silent, and entirely composed, her internal rating system began to short-circuit. Charlotte hated that feeling. So she did what the system taught her to do, reassert control by assigning him the position she believed he belonged in. The silver clipboard in Charlotte's hand gleamed beneath the yacht's deck lights. She walked toward Malcolm, her steps delicate, precise, but sharp as razors. "Excuse me, sir. May I have your name?" "We need to double-check the guest list." Her voice was soft, like Italian silk, but each word carried the chill of fabricated authority. Malcolm met her eyes directly. He spoke his name clearly, firmly, Malcolm Rivers. She nodded, quick, polite, and opened her clipboard. Her finger skimmed the first page, didn't pause, flipped again, skimmed again, as if searching for something she'd already decided not to find. Behind her, a middle-aged woman in a red dress whispered to her friend. Maybe he spelled his name wrong. A white man nearby nodded, or faked the invite. Happens all the time. Charlotte stopped, looked up, and smiled a smile with no light in her eyes. "Well, that's odd. I don't see any Rivers listed here." She turned the clipboard slightly, just enough for a few nearby guests to glimpse it. No one knew if that list was real. But the image, a black man publicly declared absent from the guest list, was enough to trigger a silent mob effect. Malcolm calmly reached into his inner pocket and presented his invitation, heavy cardstock embossed bearing the official logo of the event's hosting firm. Charlotte glanced at it but didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She had already made her decision. There must be some mistake. Tonight's event is strictly private, reserved for senior partners, or members of the organizing team. She emphasized organizing team as if gently suggesting he return to the role she believed he belonged in. Then she smiled, taking a half-step sideways, physically blocking the VIP deck entrance. "I'm sorry, but we have strict security protocols. Without official clearance, I'll have to ask you to leave the yacht." Malcolm said nothing, didn't move. But something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not confusion, just clarity. The understanding that he wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last to be treated as a stain on an otherwise spotless white tablecloth. Behind him, a young guest quietly turned on their phone camera. No words. But the red light in the corner of the screen blinked on. The story was being recorded, and Charlotte knew that. But she didn't stop. "Noah." She turned to the young security staffer near the stairwell. "Please call for an escort. Have this gentleman escorted back to the dock. We can't risk any security issues tonight." Noah froze. He looked at Malcolm, then at Charlotte. On one side, an order. On the other hand, a man tidy, composed, saying nothing. No one said a word. Not one of the dozens of guests, nearby people who had sat through hundreds of lectures on civility, human rights, and corporate ethics, spoke up. Just one woman standing near the buffet whispered, as if exhaling something she'd been holding in too long. "The world hasn't changed. It just learned to wear nicer suits." The air on the deck had thickened like sea mist at dawn. No one spoke. No one laughed. But every phone was now recording, cameras on, hands steady. Charlotte clutched her clipboard like it was her last shield. She turned to Noah and barked louder this time, her voice sharp and commanding. "Call for additional security. I've already said he's not on the list." Just 2 words, he's not, but for Malcolm they carried the weight of an entire system, built to erase people like him. Noah stepped forward. He didn't give orders. He didn't threaten. He was executing protocol. And that was the moment, the only moment, Malcolm spoke. Not loud, not rushed. His voice was deep calm and rang with the kind of clarity one saves for moments like this. "Get your manager." Firm, final, no extra words. The whole deck froze. Charlotte frowned, but before she could reply, he added one more sentence, just one. "Tell them. The primary investor has arrived." Those words weren't a threat. They weren't a punch. They were the truth. But the truth, delivered that cleanly like a blade, without a sheath, sliced through the mask every onlooker had been wearing. A whisper slipped out from near the bar. "Wait. Investor Rivers. No way." A woman on the upper deck looked down, hand trembling. "It's him. Rivers. Global Logistics. He's the CEO." Charlotte went pale. She turned to Malcolm as if seeing his face for the very first time. Not as an uninvited guest, but as something she never imagined could exist. A black man who didn't need to prove himself and yet held enough presence to bring an entire room to a halt. Her voice suddenly shrank. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Malcolm didn't answer. He looked at her. Not with anger. Not with smugness. Not with the need to win. Just the gaze of someone who had stood through a lifetime of judgment, and tonight had nothing left to prove. And in that moment, the one person who truly felt out of place was Charlotte. She swallowed hard. The silence that followed Malcolm's words wasn't like any silence before. Not awkward, not fearful, but the kind of silence that falls when a system suddenly realizes it has failed and doesn't know where to hide. A few guests turned toward one another. A man near the piano whispered to his wife. "That's him, Rivers, the one who just signed with the Pacific Alliance." Another whisper floated from the shadows near the buffet. "God. I read about him this morning. He just invested $200 million into a Hamburg logistics hub." Charlotte tried to smile, but her lips strained like they were pulled tight by the trembling hands of embarrassment. "One moment, Mr. Rivers," she said, using his name correctly for the first time. Her hands slightly shaking, she pulled out her phone and turned her back to the crowd. But she couldn't hide the truth. The entire yacht was watching her every move. She dialed. On the other end, a crisp, professional female voice answered. "This is Elena Caraway, Director of Event Coordination, Harbor Lux Global." Charlotte cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "Hi, this is Charlotte Wynn, Event Manager on Deck 7. I have a man here. He, claims to be the lead investor. But his name isn't on the list I have." Silence. Elena didn't respond immediately. Then, a long, deliberate exhale, like a pause too long for someone trying to mask a mistake. "Charlotte." Elena said, her tone even but cutting like paper. "He is the highest-level sponsor of tonight's event. We sent you the updated guest list yesterday. We also made it explicitly clear that if he attends, all privileges are to be granted to him, full access speaking rights and oversight of attendees." Charlotte stood still. Breathing suddenly felt heavier. I didn't check the update in time. I thought he was—" She stammered, then stopped. "Thought he was who?" The question didn't need to be spoken aloud. It lingered in the air like smoke, enough to choke everyone's breath on the deck. Malcolm stood there, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, because the truth was now spilling out line by line from the very lips of the one who once held control. Charlotte hung up. She turned back around and forced a smile, but it was no longer the smile of someone in charge. It was the smile of someone who had just lost her place and couldn't get it back. "Mr. Rivers, I sincerely apologize. There's been a misunderstanding. Of course you're welcome here. Please." She extended her hand, a belated gesture of politeness. Malcolm looked at that hand like it had been the very hand that tossed him off the deck just minutes earlier. He didn't take it. He nodded. No fury, no vengeance. Just a calm refusal. And in that moment, that refusal held more weight than any condemnation. Behind him, the air had shifted. Guests murmured. Some quietly turned off their phones, deleting the footage they had captured moments earlier. Others lowered their eyes, avoiding his gaze, ashamed not of what they said, but of what they hadn't. And Noah, the young security guard, still stood by the stairwell. But his eyes no longer saw Malcolm as the man to be removed. Now, he saw the only man on that deck, who stood tall, without raising his voice. Charlotte was still standing there, half-turned, half-withdrawn, one hand gripping her clipboard like it could hold together the last shards of authority breaking at her feet. And Malcolm still hadn't moved, not because he wanted to prolong the silence, but because he was used to living in it, that space between apology and accountability where most people stand and watch. He didn't need to speak, because now the entire room was speaking for him. Near the railing, a middle-aged woman in a red silk dress, the same one who had whispered, "Looks like a tech guy," stood up. She adjusted her gown, smiled, a sweetness so strained it made the pattern on her dress wilt with awkwardness. She walked toward him and pointed to a chair near the balcony. "Mr. Rivers, please have a seat. It's the best view on the yacht." Malcolm looked at the chair, then at her. He didn't smile, just nodded politely, and walked right past. Not with coldness, not with disdain, just because it wasn't necessary. Because sometimes forgiveness doesn't live in words. It lives in a silence so strong that it makes others ashamed of themselves. Behind him, the murmurs rippled like water. "I heard his company was just valued at nearly $3 billion. He's the sponsor for all 3 major West Coast ports. Unbelievable. He used to be a dishwasher." A young guest in a navy suit quietly pulled out his phone and Googled Malcolm Rivers. Instantly, his photo appeared in Forbes' then Harvard Business Review and a recent interview titled "The Man Who Built a Logistics Empire from the Bottom of the Supply Chain." Behind the bar, a young black server, maybe 18, stood motionless. His name was Jalen. He hadn't dared lift his head all night. But now, his eyes lingered, watching Malcolm as if seeing for the first time a future he had never dared to imagine. And Charlotte. She stood frozen near the entry table. No one looked at her, not one person. She still held the clipboard now, nothing more than a prop in a play whose central character had already exited the stage. A guest who'd laughed loudly earlier now sipped his drink, slowly, eyes down. Another who had live-streamed Malcolm being questioned quietly shut off their camera and deleted the video as if trying to erase the memory of their inaction. And in that exact moment, Malcolm reached into his inner jacket pocket. No rush, no performance. He pulled out a small black leather case, its edges worn by time. Inside was a nameless black card. Only a gold-embossed emblem, the mark of the Founders Circle, an elite network of top-tier logistics founders worldwide. A soft gasp moved through the room. An older man near the piano with salt and pepper hair murmured aloud, "That's a founder investor card. Fewer than 10 people in the world have one." Charlotte heard it. And for the first time that night, she had nothing left to hold on to. No list, no approving glances, just the exposed truth of someone who thought she held power. Now, realizing no one was listening, Malcolm looked at the card in his hand, then put it away. No bragging, no explanation. He raised his head and said one sentence, as light as the ocean breeze, but sharp as a blade through air. It's understandable that you didn't know, but the fact that you didn't want to, that's the problem. No one replied, not a single voice. The yacht's music had stopped at some point, no one knew when. Maybe the DJ cut it. Or maybe instinct told him that tonight silence was more important. Malcolm stood in an open patch of deck. No spotlight, no podium. But somehow the entire room had turned toward him like compasses pulled off course by the gravity of truth. A young female coordinator, far too new to grasp the full weight of what had just unfolded, stepped forward with a microphone in hand. "Would you like to speak, sir?" Malcolm gave a slight nod. "No, thank you. No refusal. Just acceptance that it was time to let the story speak for itself." He took the mic, didn't adjust the volume, didn't move to the center stage. He stood exactly where Charlotte had once tried to have him escorted to the dock. And he began, not with a speech, but with a question: who was responsible for tonight's guest list? The question fell lightly like sand, but the sound it made echoed like surf against stone. No one answered. No one dared. Malcolm looked around, didn't repeat himself, just waited. And then Charlotte, the one who had ordered security to escort this man off the yacht. She spoke. Her voice was small, fragile. It vanished the moment it surfaced. "I did." Malcolm nodded. No sarcasm, no condemnation, just acknowledgement. He lifted his phone and dialed a single number. "Please put it on speaker." The ringtone pierced the hush louder than anything in the crowd. "This is Elena Caraway, Director of Events, Harbour Lux. How may I help you?" Malcolm spoke plainly. "Elena, it's Malcolm." A slight pause. Then her voice lit up with delight. "Oh my God, Malcolm. We saw your check-in. Thank you for coming. Your foundation fully funds tonight's event. Is everything going smoothly?" Somewhere in the crowd, a wine glass dropped. No one picked it up. Charlotte stood frozen. Her face was colorless. There was only one kind of silence left. The silence of someone exposed. In the very place they thought they were shining. Eleanor continued, unaware her voice was broadcast to hundreds. "We instructed the yacht team that you'd have full speaking rights, full mobility and authority to make any changes necessary. My team is on standby to assist." Malcolm gave a soft chuckle, one that belonged to no one. "Everything's fine, Elena. Thank you." He hung up, turned to the crowd. No one moved, no one looked away, and he said one final sentence. "It's strange. We'll invest hundreds of millions into a party, but we won't invest 10 seconds to ask someone who they are before deciding they don't belong." No one answered. They didn't need to. Some looked down. Others glanced toward Charlotte. Now just a side character in the very scene she thought she had directed. She stammered something, but no one heard, because no one cared to. In the crowd, Noah, the young security guard, still stood motionless. He didn't step forward to apologize, didn't attempt small talk, but his eyes now held something Malcolm rarely saw: awareness. And that was why Malcolm's following words weren't for Charlotte. They were for him. Next time someone's being asked to leave a place they have every right to be the first one to ask, why? Jalen. The young black server pulled out his phone, not to record, but to open his notes app. And there, quietly, he began typing the words. He knew it would live inside him forever. As Malcolm stepped back from the microphone, the space on the deck seemed to contract. No one spoke, no one applauded, but everyone understood this was no longer just an incident. It had become a public reckoning, one the entire system now had to face. Charlotte was still standing there. She could no longer speak, not because she was forbidden, but because any excuse now would echo in a room where no one was listening. A man in a deep plum suit, earpiece in place, part of the event team, stepped forward. He leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Charlotte froze. Her jaw clenched, her lips pressed tight, and her clipboard slipped from her fingers onto the floor. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to tell everyone her role had ended. Her replacement stepped forward, an East Asian woman in a simple suit, calm eyes, steady. She didn't look at Charlotte. She walked straight to Malcolm. "Mr. Rivers, I apologize for what happened earlier. From now on, my team and I will coordinate with you directly." Malcolm nodded. A nod, not prideful, not cold, but a quiet acknowledgement between people who know how to listen. And then, as if an invisible signal had gone out, the energy on the deck began to shift. Some guests, those who had stayed silent during the earlier humiliation, now began repositioning themselves in this new scene. An older man approached Malcolm and extended a hand. "I'm Robert. I work in maritime freight." "An honor, truly." Malcolm shook his hand. Not warmly, not coldly, just respectfully enough. Then came a second guest, a third. A woman offered him a glass of champagne. "Is this the kind you prefer? I can have it swapped for brut if you'd like." Malcolm accepted the glass, but didn't drink. He turned his eyes toward the edge of the room. Charlotte was gone. No sound, no goodbye. Just vanished, like a shadow fading under a spotlight. Jalen, the young server, slowly stepped closer to Malcolm. He didn't dare approach fully, just hovered a few feet away. Malcolm noticed. He didn't call him over. He just met his gaze and gave a quiet nod. Jalen took half a step forward, then asked hesitantly, "Would it be okay if I took a photo with you?" Malcolm smiled for the first time that night, a genuine smile. "No need. Just remember tonight, because one day, you won't need a photo. You'll be the one people ask to take a photo with." Jalen froze. He didn't fully understand, but Malcolm's eyes held enough conviction for the seed to begin taking root. Noah, the young security guard, remained at the stairwell. He didn't come to apologize, didn't walk away either. He just stood there, with the look of someone who had just learned something more important than anything written on a clipboard: how a man can preserve his dignity, even when everything around him tries to erase it. A young woman, a new investor in the industry, approached Malcolm and asked, "How did you stay so calm when everything seemed to be against you?" Malcolm answered without hesitation, "Because I've lived a whole life being told I was wrong, before I ever had a chance to speak. And I learned something. Anger might make them hear me once, but calm makes them remember me forever." Malcolm left the center of the gathering just as the sea began to take on a silver hue. He didn't walk quickly, nor did he stroll. Just with the rhythm of someone who knew he no longer needed anything from this place. No one stopped him, and oddly, no one followed. The entire room watched in silence, not because he was a CEO, not even because he was the lead sponsor, but because in that moment, the man who had been told to leave the deck was now the only one who made everyone else stay behind to question themselves. Charlotte was no longer on the yacht. She had been escorted off through a side exit. No shouting, no scene, just a quiet withdrawal that everyone understood, but no one needed to explain. As Malcolm passed by Jalen, the young server lowered his head, not in fear this time, but in respect. When he passed Noah, the young security guard lifted his gaze, an expression in his eyes as if to say, "I learned something tonight, because of what you chose not to do." Malcolm didn't reply with words. He paused for one breath, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. Not the kind with gold foil and glossy branding, just a smooth, dark grey card with a small line of text: "Malcolm Rivers, founder. Rivers Global Logistics, show up. Stay true." He placed it into Jalen's hand without explanation, then said gently like the wind, "Come find me, when you're ready." Not to be given a chance, but to create one. Jalen stood frozen, not because of the card, but because, for the first time in his life, someone believed he could create opportunity. Malcolm continued heading toward the stairway that led to the lower deck. A few guests, the ones who had once avoided his eyes, now nodded as he passed, not to be friendly, but to reclaim a part of themselves they had lost in their silence. No one asked for a photo, no one made a grand apology, and no one said, "I didn't know," because the most evident truth of that night was, they had known. They just chose not to look. Malcolm paused one last time at the edge of the deck. The city still glowed in the distance. Lights from tall towers shimmer through the mist. The sea was quiet, not because the wind had stopped, but because, like Malcolm, it understood the right silence. It is stronger than any defense. He looked back at the yacht one final time, not to confirm his place, but to affirm he had been there, not invited, not retained, just present, and had seen everything worth seeing. Malcolm stepped off the yacht, the way one leaves a dream that doesn't need to be awakened from. No turning back, no desire for applause. No one is leading the way. He had found his path long ago in dim kitchens, in oil-soaked engine rooms, in boardrooms where people once looked right through him. And tonight, as the spotlight fell too late on faces that only now learned his name, he understood one thing. Dignity never asks for recognition. It only asks to be held. Behind him, the room stirred again. Glasses refilled. Music resumed slower this time. But everyone knew the loudest sound of the evening was not the music. It was a single calm sentence. "Tell them the investor just arrived." Have you ever walked into a room with an invitation in hand, only to be asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Have you ever been looked at from head to toe, not to be admired, but to be appraised? Have you ever stood in a room and realized they don't need you to cause trouble? They need you to disappear. If you have, you're not alone. And if you're still there, still standing, still holding your ground, then you are living proof that some presences don't need to speak loudly to make the world go quiet. As Malcolm walked away, a young woman in the crowd, who had stayed silent all evening, whispered to the person beside her, "I wish I'd said something." The other replied, "You still can." But not to him. To the next person, the world tells, "You don't belong here." Because sometimes change doesn't begin by breaking down the door. It begins when someone walks through it. Even when others try to lock it, it stands still, looks ahead and does not retreat. Not everyone gets a second chance to make a first impression, but everyone gets a chance to hold on to their dignity, even when the world refuses to see it. If you've ever been misjudged, if you've ever been left off a list, you deserve to be on. If you've ever been denied, not because you lacked ability, but because you lacked the right background, then don't forget Malcolm Rivers' final words. Show up, stay true, be present, and be yourself until no one dares to deny you ever again.